SEP FanFic Readings presents Thanks to the Photographs by Unstable Hufflepuff. Chapter 7. A Very Un-Gryffindor Escape. For a moment, there was only silence. Someone had shut off the wireless. Hermione could feel her heart thumping in her chest. All the fire whiskey she'd drunk was threatening to come back up, and she kept looking towards the back door on the other side of the kitchen, wondering if she should just make a break for it while she still had the chance. And then, in a voice so quiet and so soft that she almost didn't hear it, "She's here, isn't she?" The sound brought more tears to her eyes. She could hardly make out Harry's face in front of her anymore. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed Ron's voice. "Why are you here, Ron?" demanded Angelina. "Shouldn't you be with your wife?" She kicked me out," said Ron, sounding slightly breathless. I thought you told me she hadn't gone past Hogsmeade." "It's her fucking birthday, Ron!" shouted Ginny, standing outraged. "Did you seriously think we wouldn't be celebrating with her?" "I thought you'd have gone to the Three Broomsticks or something," exclaimed Ron. "Lav and I had a row, and I thought I didn't know where else to go. Get your wand out of my face, Ginny." "Then get out of my house. You're not welcome here tonight. It's not my fault Lavender's pissed at you." "Where is she, Ginny?" There was a scuffle, followed by a pained groan and voices shouting over each other, and Hermione looked at Harry, desperate. She glanced at the back door again, and then gave him a pleading look. Harry sighed in disappointment, but eventually nodded. He lifted her to her feet, holding her by the elbows, and helped her towards the door as silently as possible. A loud smack sounded from the sitting room, and she flinched. "Harry," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I don't want him to see me like this." "It's okay, Hermione. I've got you," whispered Harry, and he wrapped an arm around her waist, holding her close as he carefully opened the door, grimacing when it creaked. He half carried her down the back steps into the quiet of the night. When they reached the edge of the property, he wrapped his other arm around her and spun, separating them both. Hermione fell forward on her hands and knees the second her feet hit the ground on the outskirts of Hogsmeade, and she retched. Harry was quick to gather her hair, holding it out of her face, and he rubbed her back until she'd gotten it all out. He then helped her up again and held her to him as they started up the street. She could hardly see the village in front of her. The warm lights from windows and doorways blended together in a soft orange glow. "I'm so sorry, Hermione," Harry kept saying, but his words sounded slightly distorted, like they weren't real. He kept her upright while they moved, and she thought she might just collapse on the cobblestones if he were to let go. She doubted she would mind all that much. The ground looked very comfortable at that moment. The reporters would have a field day if she was found passed out in the middle of a village come morning. The thought made her laugh, but it was a sad, watery laugh that quickly turned into a sob, and Harry tightened his grasp on her. Why did it have to be my birthday?" she whimpered, and she wasn't sure if he responded or not, because all she could hear were her own sobs. "Why did he do that, Harry?" She can't comprehend what he says then, but it sounds like an apology. She wished he had an answer, because she was at a loss. It was a helpless feeling, not knowing the answer, but she didn't like it one bit. There's a new voice as they make their way further up the street, nearer to the path that leads to the front gates of Hogwarts. This one she can understand. She'd heard it so many times before, saying this exact thing, that she thinks it would be impossible not to recognize. "Potter!" There were footsteps, and she can see his shoes. They looked expensive. It was a good thing her stomach was empty, otherwise she would have vomited on them. "What do you want, Malfoy?" "What the fuck's wrong with Granger?" She almost laughs, because she'd been wondering the same thing, but it comes out as another sob. She knew Draco was staring at her, but she didn't have the strength to raise her head and meet his gaze. "I don't know," she said weakly. Harry let out a long sigh. It sounded tired and maybe a little sad. He pulled her up a bit, so she wasn't hunched over, and her head lolled against his shoulder, too heavy to keep upright. "Just drank too much. I'm taking her up to the castle now. I can take her for you if you want." Harry scoffed. "Yeah," he said, and it surprised Hermione how cruel his voice was. "Like I'd leave her with you when she's in this state." There were so many stars in the sky it nearly took Hermione's breath away. This many couldn't be seen in London, but her eyelids were heavy, and she couldn't keep them open any longer. The darkness was somehow comforting, if not a little lonely. She wasn't sure what Draco said to Harry, but she was moving forward now, so she assumed it was enough to piss Harry off and make him walk away. They were moving very quickly now. How was it that the world spun even whilst her eyes were closed? She sagged against Harry, dead weight in his arms, and faintly realized he was lifting her further into his arms, taking her feet off the ground, before she was further consumed by darkness. It was one of those mornings where one declares that they will never drink again, for Hermione. She woke to the pounding in her head and a twisting in her gut and rolled onto her side, groaning and clutching her stomach. She had no idea how she ended up in her bed at Hogwarts, but she was endlessly grateful for Harry. The sunlight flooding in through her bedroom window was bright enough to increase her headache, and she barely managed to stumble towards it in order to draw the curtains shut. Her movement had apparently been heard from the main room, because there was a soft knock on her door before Harry stepped inside, looking worse for wear with his hair messier than usual, his clothes rumpled and his glasses askew. He must have slept on the sofa. "How are you feeling?" he asked, and she winced. "That was so embarrassing," she murmured, dropping back onto her bed. She rubbed her face with her hands and sighed. "How did you know where my room was?" Harry grimaced at that. Malfoy led the way. He moved to sit next to her and brushed some of her hair out of her face. "I don't know why he knows the password, but you need to change it, okay?" Hermione rolled her eyes. "He's not that bad anymore, Harry. Well, I don't know if I'd call us friends exactly, but—" "Still," said Harry firmly, "I don't like the idea that he can get in here any time he pleases. It's not safe." "You're the one that testified at his trial," said Hermione pointedly. "If it weren't for you telling the Wizengamot that he refused to identify you at Malfoy Manor, and that he lowered his wand that night on the astronomy tower, he'd probably be in Azkaban right now." "Nah, he'd have gotten out by now. His father has, and let me tell you, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree in this case. Or did you forget that he poisoned Ron?" "Did you forget that you nearly killed him with an unknown curse?" "That was different. You know I never meant for that to happen." "Well, if you hadn't just been blindly following the scribbles in a book—" "Are we really about to have this fight again?" Hermione frowned, resisting the urge to roll her eyes again. "Sorry," she mumbled, albeit begrudgingly. "I'll shut up." Harry made a sound of exasperation and got to his feet. "I should get going," he said, stretching a little. "Ginny's probably worried. Make sure to change that password." "Will do," she lied. "I'm sorry last night ended as it did," he said, his hand already on the doorknob. He gave her a pitying look that she didn't much appreciate. "We just wanted to do something special for you. The last thing anyone expected was for Ron to show up." "It's fine, Harry. Just go. Give Ginny my love." The moment he was gone, she went to take a much-needed shower, as she was horrified to discover that she smelt faintly of vomit. She groaned as the warm water hit her face, praying that Draco had not witnessed her keeled over on the ground. She was extremely grateful that she'd passed out, and therefore did not have to witness his leading Harry up to her living quarters. She truly should swear off alcohol. It seemed to never do her much good. Who would have thought famous problem-solver Hermione Granger resorting to drinking when her feelings got hurt? Had she always been this pathetic? She decided not to dwell on that and shut the water off, stepping out and pulled on her robe. Today wasn't a tea day. No, she needed a very strong cup of coffee. She left the bathroom and crossed her bedroom floor, but just before she reached for the door, there was a knock. She opened it, not bothering to hide her surprise. Draco stared at her for a moment, his face blank, before stating, all too plainly, "You look like shit." Hermione grimaced and moved past him into the main room, calling for Kreacher. The old elf appeared before her with a pop that made her head throb and bowed deeply. "Miss Hermione call Kreacher," he said in a low, raspy voice. "What can Kreacher be doing for Master Harry's bestest muggle-born friend?" "Some coffee would be lovely, Kreacher, please. That's all." "Kreacher?" The elf was no longer looking at her, but gaping at Draco behind her. He suddenly dipped in a bow so low that his nose touched the ground. "Kreacher is honored to be in the presence of the last son of the most noble and ancient house of Black." Shaking her head in annoyance, Hermione turned to look at Draco, who was watching Kreacher with his mouth hanging partly open. Right," he said awkwardly. Kreacher straightened up again, his eyes beaming. "Kreacher used to serve the Blacks," Hermione said by way of explanation. "He technically belongs to Harry now, but he's been working here since we went on the run in 7th year." She frowned, eyeing the elf who had not moved and was now looking at Draco expectantly. "It would probably make him very happy if you asked for something." Draco nodded slowly. Right. Some tea would be nice, Creature. Creature bowed once more, his nose hitting the hardwood floor, and said, Creature lives to serve the most noble and ancient house of Black, before disapparating. Hermione pulled out a chair and collapsed at her breakfast table, wincing and shutting her eyes at the sunlight currently burning up her irises. There were too many windows here. Why couldn't it be a cloudy day? Or thunderstorming? The good weather felt like it was taunting her. Malfoy sat down opposite her and pulled a small vial out of his pocket, setting it down on the table between them. Figured you might need some peppermint potion after the night you had, he said in a voice that was too casual. He shrugged and glanced away. Consider it a late birthday gift. Hermione didn't hesitate before downing the potion, and took a moment to contemplate just when she began to trust him enough to drink whatever he offered her, while she waited for the effects to kick in. When Creature reappeared with a pot of tea and a cup of coffee, the sound didn't bother her too much, and the sunlight felt pleasantly warm. She took a sip of her coffee and nearly moaned in delight. She thought she must have made a strange face then, because Draco had his brows raised at her. What? He quickly shook his head and went about fixing his tea. All the while, Creature stared at him like an awestruck teenage girl who just met her celebrity crush. It was slightly unnerving. She didn't want to upset him, but she was getting uncomfortable, so she thanked him and asked him to return to his work. He did so, but not before bowing to Draco for a third time. I haven't seen a house elf this excited to serve someone since Dobby. Draco looked up, frowning, and Hermione suddenly remembered to whom Dobby had originally belonged. He really admired Harry, she said softly. He didn't say anything to that, and took a long sip of his tea. She wasn't sure how he could stand to drink it with so much sugar he'd put in. You know, Hermione began tentatively, Harry buried him at Shell Cottage, Bill and Fleur Weasley's place. I could probably take you there sometime, if you ever wanted to see it. She paused, slouching deep in her seat. If they let me near the house, that is. It's fine, said Draco, and they both drank in silence for a moment before he looked at her again, frowning. What exactly happened last night? Potter wouldn't tell me. I've seen you drunk, but never like that. Hermione set down her coffee and rested her elbows on the table, propping her head up on her hand and turning to look out the window. The Ravenclaw Quidditch team was out at practice on the pitch. Harry and Chitty threw me a birthday party, she said quietly. It was actually nice, until Ron showed up. You saw Weasley? She shook her head. I made another run for it. All that Gryffindor bravery went straight out the window the second I heard his voice. There was silence for another moment, and she couldn't even hear whether or not Draco was still breathing. If you left the second he got there and came straight to Hogsmeade with Potter, he said at last, how come you managed to get so fucked up? Hermione studied the Seeker as he flew smooth circles around the pitch. It really went to show how little she wanted to meet Draco's gaze when she'd rather pay attention to a Quidditch practice. When she answered, her voice was hardly above a whisper, somewhat afraid of what he might think of her if she voiced this insecurity. Did you know he got married on my birthday? There was a long exhale, followed by a pronounced exclamation of, Fuck. Yeah. I mean no offense, Granger. Well, a little. But you seriously dated that? Draco asked incredulously. Hermione, she said without thinking. Hermy. Hermione finally turned her head, glaring, but took one look at the smirk on his face, and it suddenly became very difficult not to smile. Caving, she laughed, and his smirk only grew. I'm never going to get you to say my name, am I? She asked. Draco shrugged. Probably not. She rolled her eyes and took another sip of her coffee, in an attempt to hide her smile. It was ironic that he, of all people, was able to shake her from her abysmal mood. I have a question, he asked abruptly. She raised an eyebrow. Yes? I heard Weasley's Wizard Wheezes is taking over Zonko's. That's not a question. It'll likely be ready for opening by the time of the first Hogsmeade trip. Still not a question, he scoffed. So impatient. Yes, now get to the point. Say we're asked to supervise the trip and you run into Weasley. Draco was smirking again, and Hermione had a feeling she wasn't going to like this. Do I have permission to hex him? She blinked, then let out a surprised laugh, because she wasn't immediately opposed to the idea, and that caught her off guard. I'm not hearing a no. Hermione leaned back and surveyed him for a moment, In her silence, Draco's smirk slowly turned into a broad grin that was terrifyingly handsome. She suddenly understood why Pansy Parkinson had blindly adored him for so many years. That face was hard to say no to. At last, she let out a wistful sigh, smiling a little. "I'll tell you what," she said. "If that happens, and he tries to speak to me, I give you my blessing to do whatever you please, so long as it doesn't cause any lasting damage." Draco looked as though Christmas had come early.